Let's jump in. So thank you everybody so much for joining. Um, I want to reiterate what I said last time, which is that I am a fellow traveler with you guys here. I'm not a maven, and I'm saying that just because I'm really a convener of this more than anybody else. I did study history. I do like reading history. I studied European and early American, early modern American history. But but this is, I'm on by no means any more of an expert on this topic than any of you are. So I find myself in a strange position of convening a conversation, strange but welcome position of just kind of convening this conversation. Um, in it, it, this book, there's so many different books. Obviously, we could have read, and I've chose this one not because this is the best or only book that we should be reading or article or research or whatever, but it just seemed like a good place to start. Not the only place to start. Other folks are reading other books, as I have. Ibrahim Kendi, I read a book of his, not How to Be an Anti-Racist, but another one whose name I can't remember. So there are many, many others, many different approaches, but I'm a little historically minded, and I feel like that's a good way to set the stage for what's happening in our country. That's just sort of how I think, and so there you have it. Um, I want to invite you, as I would for any book on any topic or any article, especially in this day and age, to be a critical reader who is hard to persuade. So you keep in mind that when you read her book or any book by anyone, the author has an agenda and they're trying to convince you of they're making an argument. Nobody in the world, certainly no historian, can just take facts and tell you what the truth is about the past. That doesn't work like that. Everything must be interpreted. So she's making an argument and she's trying to persuade you. So just be skeptical. I'm saying that not as a preface to tearing her book apart. I have no intention of doing that, but just as a general reminder that we should be critical readers of absolutely everything and be very dubious about anyone who's trying to persuade us of anything, unless it's your rabbi, in which case you should just take it at face value. And the I guess in particular, that's just if you'll indulge me for just a moment. In particular, that is so important right now. I'm sure we have all seen on Facebook and on television people on the left and on the right, um, being, people read anything online and there's a decent chance that they'll think it's true because they read it or somebody they know presented to them, and they thought that the reliable source who referred them to it is reliable and therefore it must be true. And it's so corrosive to our democracy right now. So whatever it is, read everything with the assumption that the person who's making an argument to you, no matter how smart and no matter how much of an expert, has to persuade you. And then that in turn gives you an obligation as a reader or as a citizen or as a Jew or whatever hat you're wearing. It means that you have to read carefully. If you want to either say at the end of something, I agree, or you want to say at the end of something, I reject this argument, you have to have good reasons for it. It can't just be like, well, this feels wrong, or I suspect this author is probably a Trump supporter and therefore I don't like the argument. That's not going to help anybody in anything. So we all have to be skeptical and responsible readers. So that's just a general point. Before we dive in, this is maybe an odd place to start, but before we dive in, just give me your general impressions. You like the book? you thought it was boring, you didn't buy it, you thought it was the best thing you'd ever read. Somebody get us started. Just general impressions of White Rage.
I found it
Yeah,
was
I'll tell you what. Sorry, I did not set us up for success. Raise your hand. Raise your hand like that, and then I'll call on you. Harvey Frankel.
Okay, I have to say I was blown away. I thought that I was pretty conversant of the black-white thing and Jim Crow and that whole thing. But just reading the history, it was so intense. I couldn't read it more than a few pages at a time. Consequently, I'm not quite finished with it. I'm up to the unmaking of the Untitled Chapter. But it was amazingly illustrative of the dilemma that African Americans find themselves in.
Great.
I was blown away. Can you hear me?
Yeah. Just barely, but we did hear you. So thank you. Great. I'm glad you were blown away. Okay. Trudy and Mel, or Mel.
Trudy first. It made me rethink everything I learned in school about our presidents, and it made me so disappointed in who I thought our leaders were in the past that had been supposedly brought up to be our heroes. And it made me realize how deep this is and that we never were taught any of this in school.
Yeah, interesting.
In my case,
Yeah.
I was taught some of it in the early 20s when I lived in the Carolinas in the service and went to Washington, saw the whites only, blacks only. It was like I was in some kind of a non-existent world. It wasn't real. And then very quickly, this is reality. And then being a Jew in the Marine Corps, waking up in the middle of the night in midair because guys wanted to have fun.
Right.
I was very thankful I was able to communicate with a number of them so that I'm here to talk about it today.
Interesting.
Because these Southern boys like a lot of things that we don't deal with today.
Yeah.
This is
Interesting.
a real book. It's a real
Interesting. Great. Thank you. Thank you both. Anybody else? All right. Hold on. Cheryl, go ahead.
Yeah. So I have bought the book. I've just looked over it so far because I've already been reading How to Be an Anti-Racist and White Fragility. So I'm just getting to this now. My slight impression of it is, first of all, I like the title White Rage much better than the title White Fragility, which don't get me started. And the other thing is I have not been, actively, or as actively as I would like fighting racism all my life, but I've been reading this and witnessing it all my life.
Right.
It's not news to me.
Yeah. Okay. Good. Yeah.
So, my question keeps coming up is, well, what do I do now?
Right.
And the other thing that unfortunately keeps coming up for me is, like, doesn't everybody know this already?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
But
Well,
apparently people don't.
I think I'll tell you, I consider myself a reasonably informed person and pretty well educated. I mean that in quotation marks. I mean, in terms of going through the motions and having all the degrees and stuff. I learned a huge amount in this book that I absolutely did not know. So my answer is no, I don't think everybody knows this. And I heard somebody else trying to get in there before Cheryl. Let's take two more comments. Mickey?
I just want to pick up on what Cheryl said. I kind of knew everything that was said. I didn't know, of course, all the details and the cases. But for me, she put it all into some kind of context. Like she
Right.
connected the dots
Right.
that were before were just little pieces of information that
That's
had
right.
different.
Yeah, well said. And that is the task of a historian. The task of a historian is not just to uncover facts. In fact, that's not even half of what a historian does. And in any event, this book is not a book of any original research. At least I don't think so. I think really this is one of those books that historians write sometimes where they take other people's work and they process it and analyze it anew. The same with Kendi's book. Again, not the one whose title I can't remember. Same thing. There's no original research in it, and there's nothing wrong with that. But what a historian does is a historian makes a narrative out of pieces of data. And in a funny way, that should be very familiar territory to in ways you might not expect to people who study Torah. I guess, or you could say people who study any text seriously. Because how is it? We all know the outlines of the story, for example, of the book of Exodus, right? There are no new facts. Every year you read Exodus, there are no new facts. It's the same letters and it's the same words and it's the same verses every single year. And yet we have, it unveils tons of different meanings, bazillions of different kaleidoscopes of universes of meaning. And so, yes, she creates a narrative out of the facts in a way that's, I think, powerful. So, okay. So Harvey, you had said one thing before I called on Mickey. What did you say?
Oh, Jack Falk has something.
Oh, Jack Falk. Jack, you want to jump in there and then I'll take over?
I think we're good for right now. Thanks.
Okay. All righty. So, all right. So here's what I want to do. And by the way, I mean, just to put cards on the table, I'm totally open to going in a different route because I've never done this before. That is to lead a conversation about a non-Torah book via Zoom with y'all. But I just sort of thought we would. I took notes on a bunch of different aspects of the first 4 chapters, and I thought 4 chapters takes you roughly through halfway of the book. And that's the 4th chapter is the one that goes up through the Reagan administration. And so my plan was just to sort of go through those different chapters and to talk about that. Let me get my own notes here. By the way, if anybody wants to refer to a particular part of the book, I do have it on my screen. I'm using Google Play to look to actually. I have the text of the book in front of me. If anybody wants me to pull it up for them. Okay, Harvey.
Yeah, I just want to say that reading the book shows to me that we need to come up with some form of reparation. Now, hopefully we'll have a super liberal government coming in, but somehow or other, we've got to take this major minority of ours and avail themselves of better education, better jobs, better prospects. I don't know how to do it,
Okay.
but we really owe them, and we owe them a lot.
Okay.
That's my feeling.
Okay, cool. So interesting. That's certainly something that has been part of the national conversation. Ta-Nehisi Coates, I don't know if people know who that is. Brilliant Black author in the Atlantic magazine several years ago wrote an article called "The Case for Reparations." But that's a different topic, important one, but a different topic. Okay, so here's what I'm going to do. As I've said, I've put my, I don't know what the opposite of bona fides is on the table. I put my anti-fides on there to let you know that I'm not a maven on this topic, but I'm the guy convening the call. So I'm going to steer the conversation, but if folks want to, if somebody wants to jump in and say something, just raise your hand and I will, I'll call on you. Also keep in mind, I can't see everybody's faces on my screen. So if you raise your hand and I'm not responding, you can just send something in the chat and hopefully I'll catch that. But I'm just going to lead us down the path based on the notes that I have. Okay. So central to her argument is this idea, whoops, I can't resist sharing screens just because we have the technology. These are just my highlighting in Google Play. You can ignore the different colors because they don't mean anything. Well, they meant something to me at the time, but they're not sensible. Well, that ain't it. Oh yeah, this line is this yellow highlighted line is totally central to what her book is about. And here she really defines what is white rage. Why is the book called White Rage? White rage is not about visible violence, but rather it works its way through the courts, the legislatures, and a range of government bureaucracies. So this is something that she expands on, expands on later in the book, especially when she gets to the 20th century and in the 1950s, and then especially with the Nixon presidency and the Southern strategy, that when one says white rage, that sounds like angry white mobs burning crosses. But she's saying it's Dafka not that. And the reason that she's highlighting that, the reason she's highlighting the fact that it's about legislation and legal decisions and bureaucratic operation is because what got her attention and started her to write this book, anybody remember what inspired her to write this?
It was Amadou Diallo's killing in New York in 1999.
Right. It was Diallo. Thank you. I think that was Eric. It was Diallo and Michael Brown, because there, the media, in response to the African American community's response to these trials was outrage and rage, and a lot of people were talking about Black rage. And she said she tried to identify something called white rage, and that's what that is. And so in this introduction here, am I in the introduction or in chapter 1? Yes, this is in the introduction, the prologue. She's introducing that's what she's going to be doing in this book. So it's already a very, very challenging argument because. And here too, she'll talk about this later again, specifically in connection with Nixon, and we'll get to that. But in our society, when we talk about racism, generally, I think the average person has in mind somebody who is wearing a Nazi armband, which unfortunately, even our day, we still have such people. Or somebody who uses horrific racist language, or somebody who has explicit hatred of people with dark skin. And she's saying that she's trying to identify something that doesn't look like that. Okay, so that's core to her argument. The other thing that she says that I think is important. And she promised here, I think she promises more than she delivers, at least in the first 4 chapters. The opposition to Black advancement is not just a Southern phenomenon. In the North, it has been just as intense, just as determined, and let's see if I continued highlighting, in some ways just as destructive. She touches on that a little bit in The Great Migration, but I sort of was curious. I felt like there wasn't as much data there as I would have liked. But let me pause there because I touched upon something that's central to her argument, and we'll have time to get to it later also. But what do you make of her very unapologetic, crystal clear framing of it, which is that it's hostility to Black advancement? Do you accept that that's what's happened in our country? Is there, setting aside the David Dukes of the world, Yimche Shemo, may his name be erased, setting aside those kinds of folks, is that what's at work in our country? Is there hostility to Black advancement, do you think?
Absolutely. No doubt about it.
Okay.
Look at the school districts, the communities. let me digress a second. The reason we live in a good community and have good schools is because we pay taxes, and that's what goes to the school system. That's the policy in this country. And there's no equalization there.
Right.
So it forces the Black folks who are socially and economically stifled, and that's deliberate also.
Yeah.
They don't get the advantages. And
Yeah.
it suppresses more and more and more as the years go by.
Right. I'll tell you. So well, sorry. Before I weigh in, any other folks who want to weigh in who've read the book? Yes, Mickey.
I don't think it's just one thing. I think
enough.
that's part of it, but especially the more recent manifestations, the voter suppression, the making it difficult for poor and Blacks. To a large extent, that's political maneuvering.
Right.
You know, you want your candidate to win, so you want to stop as much as possible any opposing viewpoints or opposing voters. So I think it's a mix of things. I don't think you could just say it's one thing.
I think that's very wise. I think there's real wisdom in that.
Hey, Rabbi.
Eric and Carrie, I see you trying to talk, but you're muted. But first, Eric.
Yeah, or Carrie can go first. I don't mind.
No, she's muted, so go for it.
Okay, good. You know, I actually have to say I love this book, but it's the one thing that not the one thing, but it's one of the things she's saying, like the reason for the white rage is this not wanting the Black man and woman to advance. And I thought it's gotta be something more than that, because I mean, it's gone on for so long. It's so deep. It's so systematic and pervasive that it can't be something that just the advancement, because then you would see white rage against other colors in equal measure, which we haven't seen. And I just feel like this is more visceral. Like it's not just against advancement. I think it's like a visceral fear of Black people that is driving this. It's not something so simple as the advancement. I mean, the consequences are, you know, they're not advancing, but I think it's deeper than that, actually.
Interesting.
I actually I would ask her to even go further with her, you know, pointing the finger at what it is.
Great point. Okay, Carrie? Somehow you're still muted, even though it doesn't say you're muted.
Cover your mics off in her computer.
Yeah, sorry, I'm gonna have to move on. We can't hear you. So Liz Stanley, and then I want to make a comment, then let's shift off of this.
So I just found out today that you guys were reading this book.
So you haven't read it yet?
I have not read the book, but I have an opinion about what I've seen in my life about the way that Black people are treated unfairly. And I feel like I just want to add what I see as an issue in regards to this idea of white rage. And I wonder, it's a question, I have a question. The question is, could it be a shame-based, we're so ashamed of ourselves that we have to keep putting them down, and we can't, our society cannot, our leaders of our society cannot bring themselves to be humble and acknowledge the wrongs of the past, and instead they continue to pass them on forward to from generation to generation.
Well, it's interesting. So something that you said triggered my reaction to this. So you used the word "we," and you know we have stopped them from
not Jews, but I mean.
No, right. As
America,
white-skinned Americans.
Yeah.
So one thing that I noticed about this book is that it is very, very focused on what I would call elites. And I'm not, this is not a criticism. It's just a fact. This is not a social history. I don't know if people are familiar with the term social history. Social history attempts to shed historical light on populations, on crowd, on cultures, not the folks who are like in formal positions of power behind the scenes. And she's not setting out to do that. Again, this is not a criticism of her book. It's just a fact. It seems to me that she's focusing on what are usually called elites in history. That is legislators, Supreme Court folks, political strategists, and presidents, etc. I'm slightly oversimplifying, but that does seem to be the emphasis of her critique and her analysis, at least of the white side of it. She gets into a little bit of social history and talking about the African American stuff, especially with the Great Migration. But what struck me, and Liz, this is like a funny riff on what you said. I'm just responding to the word "we."
Right.
I'm very suspicious of an analysis of race stuff. This is going to sound weird, where I don't feel implicated, right? If I read it, I'm like, oh, okay, I'm not like that. I'm not
That's
racist.
not me. Yeah.
Yeah, then I'm kind of suspicious of it. And I feel like, and this is not an argument that proves that she's wrong. I'm just offering this reflection. I'm pretty sure I can say with a whole heart that I am not hostile to Black advancement. But I feel like in some way I must be part of the problem, right? I'm like a well-to-do, middle-class, educated white person who's not contributing, as of this point in his life, very much to the advancement of this problem. And so I'm not saying this proves her argument wrong. I'm just saying maybe in line with what Mickey said, that it's more complex than that. But in any event, she says that what's animating this legislation and the Supreme Court rulings and this presidential decision making, et cetera, is Black advancement, or one might say maybe the changing the essential racial equation in the country. Okay. Yeah. Last comment, and then I'm gonna move us forward.
I think just the context of all this, having grown up in the 50s and the 60s and had a daily dose of watching what went down in the South throughout the Civil Rights era in the early 60s, that what she does and what she does for me is to set up this entire 150 years of resistance to Black advancement, really as a continuation of the Confederacy, as a way of essentially reversing the outcome of the Civil War. And I would say that, having spent some time in Germany playing music, what I know about German history post-war is that they spent a couple of generations trying to re-educate people to have accountability for the crimes of that generation. And we never did that with the South, where you had traitors basically,
right,
in rising up against the nation. And we did, whether it's because of Lincoln's assassination or Lincoln's innate, what did she characterize it as? He had personal complexity, and I don't remember the word she used, but that, no, certainly Andrew Johnson as a reluctant successor there,
right,
and basically killing Reconstruction in the
right.
grip.
Yeah. So Carrie, I see you waving. I can't hear you. Why don't you, if you really need to make a point, why don't you, if you could type it into the chat, then I'll share it. Okay. So listen, we're gonna go on. One thing I was really surprised by my own ignorance as somebody who's a product of the Portland public school system for K through 8. I went to Catlin Gable High School, and I have an embarrassing number of questionably useful degrees after my name. that I'm so embarrassed to say this. Am I the only person who thought that 40 acres and a mule was like the policy? Like that was the thing? But that in fact, this was a discussion that was then that was rescinded. And that this policy was this incredible policy that was so forward looking, and that it was just blown up by the president was astonishing to me. That's how the debate started, was really quite something to me. So, but I'm highlighting that because the 40 acres and a mule, and I'm not going to explain it for those who read the book. You know what we're talking about. I don't want to take the time, but the 40 acres and a mule it was so classic in her telling of what happens. It's like there's this legislative proposal that is meant to address the harms of the Civil War, and it's well thought through, and it makes its way up to the highest levels of government, and then it's sort of taken away or blown up. And in one way or another, whether it's the Supreme Court or the Congress or the presidents, it seems like that is this pattern that happens over and over and over again. And so I was really struck by that, because I think that the narrative that we have, many people have, Sarah Sturts, thank you for your note. I saw that. I'll address that in a second. The narrative we have is like one of slow and steady progress. And I guess one could still make that argument. Certainly, obviously, if you compare it to the Civil War, we don't have enslaved African Americans anymore. But I think that she reveals that there's this much more complicated story, that there's the constant battle in her telling, a constant battle between those who want to address the wrongs of the past and want to increase the voting rights of African Americans and increase economic power and deal with housing and education challenges on the one hand, and on the other hand, people who are trying to fight those advances. And it's an ongoing, ceaseless battle. And I think that is such an important argument. Such a powerful argument, because it has to transform how you see the present, right? If you believe you are an inheritor of a country that has a sort of inevitable, slow, maybe you say, tragically too slow advancement, but it is inevitable, then that puts you in one state of mind as a citizen, prepared to do A, B, and C. If you view yourself an inheritor of a battle that is unceasing since 1865, and indeed since before then you're really called upon to figure out where you're going to place yourself in that battle. Okay, hold on. We've got all kinds of folks lined up in the waiting room. Some of them are already here. I don't know what's happening. And then I was also, Trudy, somebody told me, you weren't on my screen, but somebody told me you keep raising your hand.
Well, I think, to go back to the argument about not wanting Black people to succeed, look what happened with Obama. I think that's the perfect example of the government of America's, a lot of America saying, we can't have a Black man leading us. And right out the gate said, we'll never pass anything he wants.
Yeah.
And I think that was as clear as it can be in favor of her argument.
Yeah. Yeah. And she will talk about, one of her chapters is dedicated to that, as you may know. So thank you. Thank you for that. And that does fit into that analysis, doesn't it? Okay. So this is something that I think flies under the radar of most school kids. I love that. But somebody's got to mute themselves, because I sound like I'm on some crazy Jimi Hendrix album. I can hear my own voice echo. He did like to on those albums from the late 1960s, when they first discovered the power of the different recording room technologies. Some of them, including Jimi Hendrix, went a little bananas with like the echo effects and stuff. Anyway, that's what I'm hearing in the background. So so she talks about the fact. Here's something that I do want to open this up for question, and I'm aware that we're probably going too slow on minutes per page to get through all 4 chapters of the first half of the book. But I'll tell you what, I'm going to introduce this theme. I'm going to keep going, and then I want you to file it away because this is so important. Somebody's got, can you mute yourself, please? You got to mute yourself because, thank you. It's just causing chaos. So unless you're talking, just keep yourself on mute. Okay. So what I was going to say is that, you know, obviously one of the arch enemy of the first couple chapters of her book, or maybe the first chapter, is the president, Andrew Johnson, who is unceasingly hostile to the forces who wanted to kind of punish the South and for their treasonous behavior, and to try to advance the lives of African Americans in the South. And essentially, he kind of short-circuited every effort to make lasting gains. And she points us to 2 moments, it seems to me, where she says we had, with regard to the first of them, she calls it a come to Jesus moment. I might have asked her to use another phrase, but at the Civil War and then in the 1950s, it seems like she thinks there are 2 moments where we had an incredible opportunity to really make a huge difference, and the forces aligned against the advancement of African Americans prevailed, and this was one of them. Because she says, and I don't think this is a direct quote, but she says that Southern states were essentially forgiven and welcomed back without any real conditions relating to the treatment of African Americans and their status as as voters. Johnson's well, so let me ask this question: how is that possible? Because Johnson was clearly in favor of the Union in the Civil War, right? He hated the Confederacy. So how is it possible? What was the other force at work that was making so that somebody who was a Unionist, that is against the Confederacy, could, after the Civil War, be indifferent to the advancement of African Americans? How is that possible? And I want to extend the invitation to those who have not had a chance to talk. Carrie, go ahead. You're on mute. I will ask to unmute you. Let's see what happens.
Can you hear me?
Oh my gosh, we can hear you.
I was just going to say one thing about the whole book. You know, I think her premise is bureaucratic violence in every level. And what I'm having to do, or had to do for the book, was to unlearn. I mean, I think my job at reading this and becoming more aware of racial inequality is to unlearn so much I learned. And and when you see even Abraham Lincoln, yes, he was for the black man, but he was for the Union, but he was against the black man. I mean, he wanted to have them all moved after the Union was secured to Panama or whatever that country was.
Liberia, I think.
Liberia, right. So you're seeing the bureaucratic violence that she talks about in the schools, in the court system, in the, you know, the Jim Crow laws. And then you're kind of thinking to yourself, wow, I really need to unlearn all this stuff that I learned and I thought was the truth.
Yep. And that's a great way to put it. That's a great way to put it. Yeah, it's a very powerful verb, unlearn. That's exactly right. Yeah, and I think that that's a challenge for many of us, you know, the common narratives that we have. And, you know, not to put too fine a point on it, but I'm not speaking to you, Carrie, but just speaking to everybody. There's, you know, education has changed between the generation of most of the folks on this call and my education. So I do think that some changes were made in the kind of basic, you know, American History 101 story, and certainly in the history that my kids learn and that a lot of kids learn today. A lot of the veils have been brought down, But nonetheless, there is a kind of standard American history that Americans grab onto and hold onto, and the heroism of Abraham Lincoln is one of them. Now, I actually believe that, and you know, I do this with trepidation and humility because she knows 30 trillion to the eighth power more than I do. But I think that she oversimplifies a little bit on the Lincoln. Because you know, this is an argument that I had with her book in general, but I guess it's unavoidable in any single volume that's trying to summarize this vast debate. But you know, I'm not trying to defend him with regard to his attitudes towards African Americans, but I think that you know, I think that being president in the middle of the Civil War, there's a limit to what is possible. And I think in some sense it's easy to look back and say, well, he should have done X, Y, and Z. But in terms of what was in his heart, it was clear that he just didn't, the state of African Americans was not first and foremost on his mind. And this is sort of a long way of answering the question I threw out, Carrie, that you brushed up against the answer, which is that, and this is, I think, so important for understanding race in America and American political debate, that race and the debate about state versus federal power are inextricable. You cannot separate them. Mm-hmm. And now I want to be really careful about this because I'm not saying that somebody who's a kind of classical conservative, you know, good-hearted person, free of racism, and there are many such people, who believes that state power should be, you know, balanced and federal power should be very limited. I'm not saying that those people are racists, obviously, nor am I saying that, you know, political conservatism is inherently racist, but I'm just simply saying in America, you cannot separate that mode of thinking from the issue of African Americans. It's true that the first debates about federal and state power were during the Revolution, but the country went to war around an issue that had to do with, on the one hand, state and federal power, and on the other hand, it was about enslavement. So whenever we're talking about state and federal power, we are also talking about race. That's my take. She does not make that argument explicitly, but that's my interpretation. Again, I want to be very clear. I believe that you can be pro-state rights without being racist. I'm just saying that one can't advocate that position without brushing up against the issue of race, and that it therefore has to be considered as part of the equation. So that to me came up as really core of this entire emergence out of Reconstruction, or I should say into Reconstruction, and how the country navigated that. And so that's the answer. How could Andrew Johnson, on the one hand, be totally against the Confederacy in the war and hate the Confederacy and the Confederate leaders, and then on the other hand, be totally indifferent to the plight of African Americans? The answer is because for him, the Civil War was about Southern elites who were being traitors. He didn't care that they were slaveholders. It was about state rights versus federal rights for him. So they're intertwined, but he tried to separate them. Okay, I'm going to keep going. Let's see, it would be foolish to not talk about, oh no, what have they done to me here? 1 second, my notes are all screwed up. Hold on. Okay, there we go. I'm going to share the screen again. So the Dred Scott decision, there are probably, I know there are lawyers amongst us who know much more about this you've probably studied Dred Scott in a way I have not. But we need to remember that, and now we're going back before the Civil War, that the Supreme Court of the United States, and so we're talking about, 80 years after the country was founded, said that blacks do not have to, African Americans do not have to be considered citizens, and the federal government cannot require that they be considered citizens. If I'm mischaracterizing it, I hope a lawyer will let me know that. So that was the way the Supreme Court understood that. Black people were not to be considered citizens. So that's 1856 or something like that. And so that precipitates that's one of the factors precipitating the Civil War. And there was, a lot of the time she talks about racism that is not explicit in the Reconstructionist era and the Civil War era. Even the pro-union side of the country, the Supreme Court, I'm including as part of the Union, was outwardly racist. President Johnson said, "This is a country for white men, and by God, as long as I'm president, it shall be a government for white men." Okay, so anyone who has the notion that starting at the Revolutionary War with a slight hiccup during the Civil War, this country has always been a place where all people are considered equal and it's sort of make your own opportunity, that person is just not aware of our history. Okay, I'm kind of not sure where to go from here because I have so many notes. But let's do this. Let's talk about two things. One is, give me a sec here. Okay, the Freedmen's Bureau Bill and the Civil Rights Act of 1866. What's fascinating about this is that Johnson says, is it on the next page? Oh, there it is. Johnson, one of the things that's so powerful about this book, and she doesn't, I think what makes it powerful is that she's not explicit about why she's doing this. But I think that she's deliberately trying to find, or I guess she's trying to expose us to the idea that many of the notes in our current political debate have been around since the Civil War, if not before. So Johnson opposed the Freedmen's Bureau Act because he was convinced that it was, you see it right here, designed to set up black dependency on the federal government. I don't know of a fair way to say this, so I'll just say it. That continues to be a talking point on the political right. Now, maybe there's. I'm not a social theorist. I'm not a policy guy. I can't talk about the sociology of federal programs. I'm just pointing out the fact that that idea that there's a concern that social programs will create dependency among the black community is very, very old in our country. A lot of people think that started in the 50s and the 60s with the conservative response to the civil rights program. That is Andrew Johnson speaking in 1865 or 6. The other thing, and after this I'll pause, she says that let me see if I can go to 39. That's where I have a note. Why am I doing it this way? One second. My apologies for my sloppiness here. Yeah. So the Civil Rights Bill of 1866, which was intended to help voting among African Americans, there was here a hostility among the South and among the supporters of the Southern states, including President Johnson, who were very hostile towards anything that would expand the voting power of African Americans. So voting rights is still obviously a very hot issue in our country. It's still debated. And that also is a very, very old debate. And so in some ways that are quite shocking, our country is still locked in the same discourse, obviously very, very different circumstances. Nobody would claim that the plight of African Americans is the same as it was in 1866. But in terms of the outlines of the debate, dependency on the federal government, voting rights of African Americans, these are things that are still core to the civil rights debate. Let me pause there and let me just see if there are comments or questions of folks who want to jump in who have not had a chance to do so yet. Okay. Carrie, I'm going to hold off. First of all, we can't hear you. And second of all, I want to give a chance to those who have not spoken, okay? Thank you for understanding. Okay, Carrie, go ahead. Carrie, you're still muted.
Okay,
Yeah.
there.
Okay.
Is that better?
Yeah. They always have something to say and they never know what they're talking about.
What I didn't quite understand ever were the black codes that he talked about.
Okay.
And
all right, let's look at that. Because I've got it right here.
That Johnson initiated the black codes and the Jim that he totally supported, and like no one's ever talked about those to me.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Right. Well, certainly not in school. You don't get that in school. Yeah, I mean, I think that's just a response to what I was just talking about, that on the one hand, you had these advances in legislation, and this is the pattern she sets up again and again, advances in legislation, and then there's bureaucratic, as you said, bureaucratic violence or Southern state modification of those things that are done in response to essentially undermine their effect, to nullify their effect. So I don't know. We could read through here and find what she says here. The codes required that blacks sign annual labor contracts with plantation, mill, or mine owners. So on the one hand, it's yes, they're no longer enslaved. On the other hand, they in many cases were effectively enslaved. So the black codes were things that found a way legislatively and legally to effectively consider continue slavery with modifications. That's what the black
And they arrested only black people for certain crimes, right? I think.
Yeah, I don't remember that specifically, but yes.
Yeah, that was what really got me.
Yeah.
So that they would be the forced labor on the
That's
plantation.
Right. That's right. Yeah. So so then let's see that. So maybe I tell you what, this is what we're going to do. We're going to just get through chapter 2, and then that presents us with a challenge, because next time we want to get to the. Well, we'll figure it out. I'm going to take about 20 more minutes and to wrap up. So then what happens? She says that effectively, what I thought was really shocking is that her conclusion to her assessment of the post-Civil War era was this. I'll let you read this on my screen.
Nobody can read that.
For those who can't read it, while the United States may have won the Civil War and blacks may have tasted freedom, the white opposition that ruled from the White House to the Supreme Court all the way down through every state house in the South meant that real change was infinitesimally If you could, folks could mute. I'm sorry. There's a lot of voices coming through. It makes it a little hard to hear.
I never know what they're doing, old people. I'm just saying.
Hey, folks, can you mute? Because we can hear you talking. Thanks. Thank you. So the advancement was infinitesimal at best, she says, which is really shocking. That's an incredible. This is not the Civil War you learned about in school.
Right.
So that I think, as you said, Carrie, we're having to unlearn so much about this. Let me ask you
Are there people on this call that don't know how to mute themselves? Because I see some people that have not been muted this entire time. It's on the bottom left. You click mute.
Thank you. Okay. So, interesting. Okay. Here's the deal. What I want to ask is, what is it that we are to do with her central argument? What is a response of a citizen to her argument? So her argument is, if I'm just going to summarize it, her argument is that there's this continuous hostility to African American advancement, starting, well, she begins in the Civil War. What do? We read this book, and then what? How should this? What should you do with the information that you learn in this book? I'm throwing that out to everybody. How does a citizen use this book, or how does a Jew use this book? All right. Well, I'm gonna lay that challenge at your feet, but I think that I think that we're called upon to develop an answer to that. I don't think we have to have the answer right now, but I think that we're called upon. Folks, I got to ask you to mute. I'm sorry. I'm betraying my frustration here, just because there's just so much echoing. Thank you so much, Michael Falk. I assume it's Falkenstein. Can I get you to mute? I just see Falcons, but I think it's Falkenstein. Could you mute? Okay, Trudy, go ahead.
I sent messages to the 3 people and asked them to mute themselves.
Okay, Trudy, go ahead. Excuse me, not Trudy. I'm sorry, Sarah, go ahead.
Robert and I were just sitting here because, you know, you wonder if you're not very involved in the community and you're not hiring or giving opportunities to anyone, what is it that you can do besides amending and improving your biases or your attitude? And Robert says, vote. That's one thing you can do is vote.
Right.
And I would throw that out there for us to digest.
Okay. One thing is you can vote. Absolutely. Absolutely. Something that too many Americans do not do, as we well know. What else do we do with this book? So, sorry, one other thing. I continue to hear echoes, and this is going to sound really grumpy. If you're not muted, I'm going to remove you from the call. Okay, and I hate to do that, but I'm going to have to mute you because it's creating feedback and an echo, okay? I'm going to do that in about 10 seconds. All right, anybody else?
I just wanted, this is Paul here. I just wanted to say that I've been sending postcards. I've been sending postcards to voters, and I think it's a really good thing to do. And my postcards, they go all over the state, different states for people to vote by mail, since they don't have it like we have it here. So mine have all been going to different counties in Florida. And so you can start doing it by doing, I think the website is postcardstovoters.org.
Great. Okay, thank you. The other thing that we can do, those are both excellent. The other thing we can do is we can, hold on, Carrie, I'm muting you because there's an echo coming from somewhere. So I'm now officially muting everybody. I am like Darth Vader of the Zoom world here. I'm like getting increasingly intense about this. It's just very, very hard to hear. So, the other thing I think you can do is read more yourself. Again, don't take Carol Anderson's word as the gospel. She's pretty awesome and clearly a pretty smart historian, but read more about it. You know, that's what I intend to do. I want to read more about our history. I'm actually reading a book about the Civil War right now, which is, it's not about this topic per se, but it's about how the country navigated the Civil War and what it revealed about this country and the aspects of the debate about the current debate about our country that are rooted in the Civil War. But I think, you know, learning about race and how it plays out in the politics of this country. The book that I'm reading, Jack Falk asked me, is called The Destructive War. The Destructive War. It's from like the early 1990s. It's by a guy named Charles Royster. It's an incredible, incredible book. And then the other thing is to share information, right? As we all know, or share recommendations. As we all know, people on the left and the right, including myself, don't know anything about anything. We all have very, very strong opinions, and we don't have that much to back them up. So read and educate ourselves. So that was another thing that I wanted to say. So let me let me shift now into the second chapter. So here she talks in the second chapter. This is really where now we're in the post-Civil War era, and she talks about, and hold on. Hold on. My boys are listening to Hamilton downstairs, and for some reason it's coming through my speaker. That was so perfect in so many ways. If I gotta say, if I hear that album one more time, I'm gonna go completely insane. Someone help me. It's everyone in my house.
They will grow out of it eventually.
It includes my wife. I don't know if there's anything to grow out of, but I've heard it like 30,000 times. It is a work of genius, and it's very much on the topic in some ways that we're talking about, but I'm going crazy. So anyway, so this chapter in some ways hits close to home in this sense. So the Great Migration, on the one hand, she talks about the Great Migration and the fact that, you know, the story we all learned in grade school was, you know, hundreds of thousands of African Americans go up to Chicago, they make great art, and they make and life changes for them, and they're no longer enslaved. And sure, it's kind of tough, but it's better. And that's, you know, that's not the story. So the story is Africa, that labor markets opened in the North, African Americans started to leave the South, and Southern states did everything possible to prevent that from happening. They used every bit of bureaucratic trickery, legal trickery, and force and violence to prevent African Americans from leaving the South. And then once they got to the North, and this is where it hits kind of close to home, things were horrific in a totally different way. So we're talking about Chicago, we're talking about Detroit, race riots, and specifically redlining. So now, redlining, I'm not even sure she uses that term. She might, but essentially, in informal districting that effectively made it impossible for African Americans to live in certain neighborhoods. So the segregation of white and black housing. So when I say this hits close to home, I mean that for me, quite seriously and quite literally. So I live in and so I'm going to open this up and stray from her book a little bit. I live in an awesome neighborhood, close to the shul, and I love it. And the shul helped me move in here and to live here because I wanted to be walking distance from the synagogue. I don't know what the African American population is in my neighborhood, but it's something close to zero. It is not illegal, obviously, for African Americans to live in my neighborhood. So I think there's like 2 or 3 African American folks in the neighborhood. They're awesome people. They're young people. They're fabulous. It's legal for them to live here, but almost none of them do. And in fact, these guys, they're kids. When I say kids, I mean they're, you know, in their 20s. They're moving out, they're moving on up is actually what they're doing. They're moving to a nicer neighborhood. these two young entrepreneurs, a bigger house and all the rest. But when they move, it'll essentially be almost entirely a white neighborhood. I don't know what to do with that. I look across this huge, beautiful house that my neighbor has. Jewish guy, white guy, he's a doctor, and I see in his window this lovely rainbow colored BLM, Black Lives Matter. And in Yasher Koach, we also have a BLM sign on our lawn. But we live in a complicated world. Again, it's not illegal for Black people to live here, but I think that I asked earlier, what do we do with this book? I don't think the response to this book is to say, oh man, those Southern legislators and those mean Northern legislators were so evil and so crafty in undermining Black advancement. We got to really fight that kind of stuff. For me, the message of this book is let's find the ways that racism works in our culture that we're not even aware of, that seem hidden. Because one of her primary concerns, and then I'll pause here because I would imagine with this you have your own thoughts, one of her primary concerns as she shifts into the 20th century in her book is to say that explicit racism starts to be very hard to come by. Right, like and especially in the 1950s and the 60s, and Nixon and his strategists, and she quotes John Ehrlich as saying that, yeah, of course we weren't using the word Black, but we all knew that these were anti-Black policies. So I think that the challenge for us is I'm not suggesting that we're direct inheritors or I'm an indirect beneficiary of redlining or anything like that, but I am saying that racism starts to work in our society as we get into the 20th century, according to her argument, in very complicated ways that don't look racist. We're not talking about Klansmen. We're not talking about lynching. We're not talking about just the knuckle-headed fools that we see around us who wear Nazi armbands or carry Confederate flags in order to intimidate Black people. We're talking about stuff that is much more subtle and hard to detect. And I want to challenge all of us to try to think about and identify those things. So I'll pause there and see if there are comments. I really would like to hear from those of you who are a little gun shy about talking. I'm not going to make anyone speak or call you out, but I just want to make sure that some people, it takes them, like if you're like me, it takes you about 8 milliseconds to decide that you have something that the group must hear. But other people, it takes them many minutes. And I want to, the fact that they're not speaking doesn't mean they don't have something smart to say. So I want to make sure that we clear the space for those. So thoughts about what I just said?
I think that there are quite a few people that have experienced interactions with African American professionals who have been very frustrated with the city of Portland. I think that we have not been very friendly. We have had historically a culture of Portland nice, which is everybody's all friendly and smiley on the surface, but the sharks swim underneath the water here. And you can see by the extremely long period of time that it took the local government folks to include Meeby-Weeby, minority-owned business, Portland-owned businesses, women-owned businesses in public contracting. They also have been very slow to incorporate North Portland and traditionally African-American parts of the city into, having a say in local government. I mean, right. You can just see what happened around Emmanuel Hospital and around, they basically, using eminent domain, took the property of people because, frankly, they could.
Right.
And, we as a community who have been, chased around the world and kicked out of countries all over the place, can appreciate, you know, when people are smiling nicely to us and stabbing us underneath the ribs
Right.
at the same time.
Right.
I could point to Spain and other countries historically that did stuff like that to the Jewish people.
Really good.
And I think that there's a window right now when you're saying, what do you do with this book? So what I'm doing right now around this particular topic is reaching out and buying things from African-American owned businesses, restaurants, general contractors, mostly fairly small. But you know, we have a pretty strong African-American Chamber of Commerce, and there's businesses. There are websites with lists of African-American businesses. Anyway, that's my share, and I'll take all the questions outside.
Andy, I love that, and I love the concreteness of that, and that using what's the word, patronizing African-American businesses. I love the concreteness of that, because it seems like that should be part of the equation. Okay, Cheryl is back in the waiting room. She was just here. Okay, sorry. Anybody else? Thank you, Andy, for weighing in.
I have to, Trudy.
Go ahead, Trudy.
Growing up in Oregon, growing up in Portland, and never ever learning the history of, when we learned the history of Oregon, we never learned that it was a whites only state. And now I moved to California, where there was such a multitude of cultures, and coming back here after 40 years, and my grandchildren don't know any more than I did back in the 40s and 50s. And I think, how are they ever going to learn to deal with other cultures and things when they're not exposed to it? And how can we expose them when I live in Tualatin, they live in Tualatin, there's no one out here.
Right. Yeah.
It's very hard to try and teach the next generation when they don't even know what we're talking about.
Yeah. Yep. Yep. Absolutely. Okay, Liz Stanley, and then Carrie, and then I'm gonna take us home here.
So I want to know what we're going to do to get those terrible laws off of our books. I think, you know, that they're still on the books is horrendous.
Well, no, they're right. No, many of them are not. But I'll tell you what. Let's wait till we get to the next discussion in the second half of the book before we start talking concretely about that. Okay, I don't want to speculate about.
Okay. The only other thing I wanted to say is that as far as how I'm trying to support the Black community, I did march in the Black Lives Matter demonstration that we had right through Beaverton. I did do that. But I volunteer with one of our Black families here. And I take care of kids, and we talk about race issues, and I'm very active in children's lives and families' lives. So that's
awesome. Yasher Koach. Good. Every little piece of goodness matters. You know, another thing I'll say, and then Carrie, I'll call you in 1 second. Another thing I'll say, just close to home, that you know, when we talk about, well, let me be a little more clear. I talk about Black folks as though Jewish folks and Black folks are like, those are exclusive categories. And, you know, I think it's fair to say Portland does not have an enormous Black Jewish population, but there are Jews of color. And so in our congregation, you know, as we have this conversation as a little congregational family, in our congregation, I think that we can think about the ways in which we are passively or actively welcoming Jews who don't look like us, because that's a real thing. You know, nationally, it's become much more of an issue in places like LA and New York and Chicago and, where there are bigger Jewish populations, this is something where there's much more of a discussion. But, you know, in Portland, there certainly are Jews whose skin is not white. And so beginning just to think about what does that look like and feel like for them in our communities is really important and very immediate work that can be done by us. Carrie.
She's muted again.
Yeah.
Carrie, we can't hear you.
Okay, now can you hear me?
Yeah.
I think that if you look around now, we've hit sort of a tipping point where it is kind of a time that we can make change. And I think, you know, I'm seeing the Nike ad that came out last week, and corporations really putting their best foot forward. And most ads on TV, you now see Black actors all over. I mean, everybody's making a concerted effort, and I think it's sort of a timing thing. I mean, if we just can all take it and run and learn more, and I particularly have to do it myself because I have 2 Jewish Black grandchildren, and so I'm continually trying to talk about their brownness, their Judaism, and it's really hard. And so I've had to, like I said, unlearn everything,
yeah,
and relearn it and reframe it. And you know, a Jewish, a black son-in-law, and you know, a whole Black family that.
Right. So for you and for them, this is not theoretical, any of this.
No, but it still is. You know, I mean, it isn't, but it is. I mean, he's still stopped all the time by police. They see their father stopped for doing nothing. He has dreadlocks, and we're out to dinner in Palm Springs or someplace, and he's a really, you know, kind but scary looking. We're constantly getting into some sort of racial situation.
Right.
And for the kids, it's different because we're all white. 14 of us are white. And so having to educate them that they're not white.
Yeah.
And so I try to read everything, and this is a good author, this Kisi Lemon, I don't know, but I'm really learning from this book and from.
Gary, do they live here?
They're here now, but they live in Los Angeles.
Got it. Okay. Well, thank you for sharing that. Right, and every time their dad gets stopped, they're in
the back seats.
Yeah, it shapes who they are. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So thank you for that. I'm going to sort of wrap us up with a thought, and I think that I guess that my attitude in general, and I'm not sure that this disposition in the wake of the death of George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter resurgence, I don't know if this is a sufficient disposition or a correct disposition, but my disposition has been, right now, my job is to learn and to listen. Yeah. And that this is not the time for middle-class white guys to say, okay, here's the legislative or the political answer or the economic answer to this race situation in our country. And that's it. I want to be clear, but it's not that only people of a particular group can weigh in on a particular issue. I'm not saying like non-Jews aren't allowed to talk about Israel and white people are not allowed to talk about the African-American culture. I'm not saying that, but I'm saying at this moment, I think that we need to be listeners. White-skinned folks need to be listeners. And in particular, I'm looking to African-American leadership and kind of following the lead of the African-American community. Now, obviously, African-American leadership is as diverse as anything else. But for me, that's one of the takeaways from this, is to say that this is an opportunity, this horrific tragedy and the awakening of young Black leaders is an amazing opportunity for our country right now, to listen and to seek guidance. We don't know the answers. I will say this, I saw something on Facebook earlier today that there's been all this talk about defunding the police. I don't know anything about this issue. I have not yet looked into it. But there are a lot of young Black people who are talking about defunding the police. Now, you may disagree with that, but I think that let me put it this way. It's not a good look right now for white folks to say, on its face, that is a stupid idea. And if you're considering it, you don't know anything. Right? I saw a post on Facebook that was responding to like a gang shooting somewhere. And the person was using this shooting as like conversations over evidence that defunding the police is impossible. So I think what's interesting about that kind of attitude is that it assumes that the young Black people who are proposing defunding the police are so stupid and thoughtless that it hasn't occurred to them that there's going to continue to be violence and that they haven't thought through that as part of their proposal. Again, I don't know. I've not read about defunding the police. I don't know if I'm in support of it. I don't know if I'm opposed to it, but I'm using that as an example. This is a time for us to listen and to be curious. You don't have the answers. None of you has the answer. None of you, and I'm including myself, know the answer. The reason I know that is because all of you are good people. And if you had the answer, we'd be set. You don't know the answer. This is the time, I believe, for us to listen to young Black leaders, not at the exclusion of anybody else. It's not some like racial priority thing, but this is a time for us to listen. That's one of my takeaways. The other thing I want to say, and then I'll close on this and give y'all closing comments, and then maybe you can make recommendations as to how we can approach the next phone call to make it valuable to you, because we only have one more call and we didn't even get halfway through. Is one of the things that kept coming up for me, even though it's on the one hand, it's a very depressing book, I actually think there's a way to look at it as very empowering. And this is what I mean. Sometimes people have a view of American history, and I mentioned this earlier, a view of American history, whether it's, people are starry-eyed and Panglossian about like things always get better or this is the best it can be, or they have the sense of like, well, we were, the original sin of slavery just determined that things were always going to be horrific in this country. And it's as though things had to be the way they are. And it's a funny thing to say about reading, after reading such a book like this, but what was clear to me is that things were not inevitable. In every generation, in the Civil War generation, in the Reconstructionist generation, in the 1920s and 30s, in the 1950s and 60s, in the 70s and 80s, in every moment, there were folks, not just common folks with good hearts, but like hardcore legislative battles being fought, people who really were trying to make a difference and trying to increase African-American empowerment and increase African-American financial well-being and education and all the rest. She outlines the losses, which are heartbreaking, but it's really important to walk away from this, I believe, and to say that, if there had been maybe more white folks tuned in, or more attention, or more skilled legislators, or more this or more that, the country might have taken a different course, which of course means if we do what we need to do, then the country in the future can take a different course so that Carrie's grandchildren can live in a country where they feel like they are valued as much as every other citizen and have every single opportunity that every citizen has. So there's no inevitability. And I believe that as Jews, that's such an important, essential, fundamental fact that we hang our entire moral and ethical and religious lives on, the idea that The script is not written. On the one hand, we hold this great paradox. On the one hand, there's one God of heaven and earth, and in some larger sense, everything is determined by God. But God has created a universe within which he's waiting for human beings to be the moral actors and to heal the world in a way that God literally can't. God made us so that God would need us to heal the world. So we must not have any sense of fatalism or despair, but rather see this book as an instruction manual for what might be. Okay, closing comments, and then I'll see you next time. Going once, going twice.
I want to thank you.
Okay, Josh,
Yes.
maybe
May-
after
Yeah, go ahead.
after we go through this book, maybe there could be other speakers from Portland that would know about what happened at Vanguard, and you know, maybe
interesting. Yeah.
maybe
Yeah,
we
great thought. Yeah, folks, to continue kind of education about our own history.
right, our own history here, and
Nice.
and there are lots of people in town that can do that, and maybe we should welcome that and listen, because
Great.
like you said, we need to
Right.
listen.
I like it. We'll talk about next steps. That's definitely something that should be on the table. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. So listen, I will see all of you. I know I'll see all of you tomorrow at 8 a.m. for our morning services. And
Right.
I want to thank you all for taking time being here tonight, and I hope you enjoyed the book. Also, I would love your suggestions about how to structure the conversation next time, because I feel like I was sort of going through my notes. It was good. You had great comments, but I don't know if this is the best way to do it. So if you have suggestions, call me or email me. And when's the next call? The 16th, is that right? I think it's the 16th at 6. Okay.
Yep.
Thank you so much, everybody. Take care.
Thanks.
Have a great night.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thank you. Bye.